I'm going to try speaking from my heart because Jesus actually doesn't like it when I read from a script when I make my videos. I've been doing that lately because, well, I had a lot to cover and I wanted to make sure I didn't leave anything important out. But I've been thinking a lot about Zach Knight coming to Jesus and why this happened and why I don't think Angelina Ballerina will ever come to Jesus. There's Zach Knight, when he was the Jesuit leader, he's a better leader than Angelina Ballerina is. When Zach Knight came to Jesus, I believe he's gotten about 90% of the Jesuits now to accept Jesus. And Zach Knight used to be Satan's right-hand man. And so you might say, well, how does Zach Knight do it? Zach Knight had a cause, okay? Now, whether you agreed with his cause or not, he had a cause, and he believed in his cause, and he was willing to die for his cause. And that enabled him to attract a following. Whereas Angelina Ballerina doesn't really have a cause. Her only cause is herself. She's just totally selfish, and I guess those who follow her are those who've never experienced true love in their lives. They've never lived for anybody outside of themselves, and they're just selfish and proud like she is and have found a kindred spirit. She's just totally evil and enjoys being evil, and Jesus said she's 1,000 times more evil than Zach Knight. Whereas Zach Knight, he was evil too, I'll grant you. When he was the Antichrist, he was evil, but he had a cause. And he was able to get a woman to genuinely fall in love with him, and that was Rule 13, the military leader of the Jesuits. And I look at it this way: if you can get somebody to genuinely love you, then you must have some good in you somewhere. Or the true love can never happen with a totally evil person. So he had to have some good in him somewhere that Rule 13 fell in love with him. And when he got pushed up against the wall and he had to make the choice whether to choose evil or true love, in the end he chose love, and that's why he's with Jesus, on Jesus' side right now. He decided, after it looked like the entire Jesuit order was defeated and only he and Angelina were alive, and he was crying his eyes out, realizing he thought that Rule 13 had died because Satan and Angelina came into his semen bubble and lied to him and told him that she was dead, even though he risked his life using CPR to try to save her. He was crying his eyes out in that semen bubble and realizing, you know what? My existence means nothing without Rule 13. He realized now that she was what made his life worth living. He found true love with her. And when he thought she was gone, that's when he realized that everything he'd been living for before wasn't worth it. And I said, I'm going to be able to reach that guy for Jesus now. And I was right. Jesus says I have very high emotional IQ. He says you're like, and he says I've got the highest IQ of any woman on the planet. So and he says your emotional IQ is a large part of that. And he says the traditional IQ machines and measurements, they don't get it, but they have a machine on Church of Gale that measures IQ, and I'm just way up there. So I'm trying to find the words. So anyway, so I led Zach Knight to Jesus. And I says, don't you want to spend heaven with Rule 13? She's alive, Zach. Satan and Angelina lied to you. How could you ever trust them ever again? And that's how I led him to Jesus. And Zach Knight has been doing a lot of soul searching in the past couple weeks now that he's come to Jesus. And I've been sensing this brain to brain, and Jesus has been primarily using me to reach Zach Knight for him, because Jesus knows that I understand Zach pretty well. Zach had a cause, and basically, Satan fell because of pride and because he enjoyed being evil. And he thought that he knew better than God how to run the universe. So he basically attracts a following from people that enjoy the same type of evil he enjoys. Satan is a very sexual being. And for his followers, he looks for people that have a strong sex drive and who feel thwarted or feel like God is unfair to be, to lay down rules regarding sexuality. Why would they feel like, why should God lay down all these rules? And then Satan lies a little bit because Jesus is not a cock blocker, but Satan has caused the Christian church to become like a cock blocker type of an institution. And so my next book that I'm writing, which I'm going to have with Zach Knight and Rule 13 as the main character, I will be exploring how Satan has created this false image of God as a cock blocker and how he uses that to gain a following. So what he does is he lies to his followers and he says, hey, God is so unfair. He sends you to hell just because you enjoy sex outside of traditional marriage, or because you like to have sex outside of the missionary position, or because you like homosexual sex or lesbian sex, or you want to have sex with animals, or group sex, or bukkake. And that's just not fair. Why does he create us with a sex drive if he puts all these restrictions around it? And then Satan knows he's lying. Satan knows that actually Jesus told me, he says, Gail, Zach Knight thinks that I have a problem with him having sex with animals and introducing elephants into his love with Rule 13. But he says, hey, man, all for it, man. I have no problem with this. I mean, if Rule 13 wants to throw in some elephants when he's making love to Rule 13, all power to them. He says, I don't care. He says, Zach Knight thinks I care about that. I don't care. But see, Satan knows that this is how Satan gets a following. He lies to his followers and says, oh, God's this restrictive prude who's not fair. And he says he won't let you have sex with animals. He won't let you have, you might say, doesn't the Bible say in Leviticus and some of these? Okay, you got to understand, okay, the Old Testament books where God seems to condemn homosexuality. I think it's in Leviticus, Deuteronomy. And God set the Jewish nation to be a separate people for himself. And whenever you read any Bible verse, you need to read it in context, okay? And he gave them rules like don't eat pork, don't work on the Sabbath, and don't have homosexual relations. And, you'd have to read. It's long and complicated. And those were all for the Jewish people to show that they were a set-apart nation, to be God's special nation, his representatives as a nation. And that was mainly what it was for. It wasn't that he was necessarily against all the things that he mentioned. He was just against it for that particular nation. Like if you were Jewish, it was perfectly all right to eat pork. But if somebody wanted to be a Jew or wanted to belong to the nation of Israel, they couldn't eat pork, or they'd have to abstain from certain sexual behaviors. So when God went into the church age and he kind of temporarily laid Israel aside, all those laws no longer apply to us. Anyways, this is really deep theology. I would highly recommend listening to Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who I think is one of the best theologians out there. I don't agree with him on everything, but he goes a lot into why we don't have to do the stuff that that God told the Jews to do today. Okay? You got to kind of rightly divide the Bible and understand, like in Timothy, where it says women are to be silent in the churches. Jesus said, Gail, that's not a general rule for all women. It was just for that particular church. He said, but the Christian church has taken that out of context and tried to make it apply to all women. He says, when you read a passage in the Bible, you need to read it in its context, considering which book it's in, who that book is addressed to, and what I was trying to accomplish in the writing of that book. So he said that Corinthian church, he said like the Corinthian church had problems. And so he had to lay down a specific set of rules just for the Corinthian church. Anyways, to make a long story short, Zach Knight, I could sense brain to brain that Jesus and Zach had a long talk finally. But Jesus primarily let me deal with Zach. And when I wrote the prenuptial agreement for Zach, I didn't want him to feel deprived because I knew that was the main reason, one of the main reasons he followed Satan. And I didn't want to put any restrictions on him that I didn't feel God wouldn't put. So I said, he said, you can have bukkake, you can have sex with animals and group sex and even, and you can have a marriage list, Zach. And I said, Rule 13 can. Now, for the rest of the guys on my marriage list, I don't want to go that way because I think it'd be better not to. But you'd have to read my prenuptial agreement. So basically now I'm writing a book to go deep into the heart of Rule 13 and Zach Knight. And my goal is to reach any Jesuits out there or people that think that God is a cock blocker and show them a side to God that they just would be amazed to know about. He's not a cock blocker. God doesn't have any problem with any type of sexual behavior as long as you don't hurt innocence in the process and as long as you honor love. That's mainly what he's concerned about. He's not anti-homosexual. He's not anti-lesbian. And so I'm currently writing a book with Zach Knight as the main character. And my goal in writing this book is to show the heart of God through Zach Knight. I'm using Zach Knight as the main character, showing why he followed Satan, why Satan chose him to be his right-hand man and his Antichrist, and why Jesus ended up getting Zach Knight. That's what the whole book's about. Basically, it's an exploration. It's going to be a character story where Zach Knight is the Antichrist, but he starts feeling unhappy in his role when love comes into his life in the form of Rule 13. And he realizes that to follow Satan, he can't love Rule 13. And this bothers him with vomiting and nightmares. But he feels like he's stuck because he just feels like he could never be good enough for Jesus. And I'm going to show through this book how God was able to use me to show him what Jesus is really like. See, Satan gets a large part of his followers by lying to them about who Jesus is, by trying to portray Jesus as this unfair cock blocker who has these ridiculously high standards for everybody that nobody can follow, and, you know, who's not fair to Satan and those who are in sin. And it's kind of complicated. All that has to do with free will and everything. And I'm going to be going really deep into this. Angelina Ballerina is just totally selfish. She's very evil. I don't think she'll ever come to Jesus. I think she's hopeless. I have a feeling Jesus pleaded the fifth on this, but I have a feeling she may end up becoming the Antichrist. She's in her first reincarnation now. She's probably going to turn into a transgender man and end up being, I don't know. I don't know. Jesus pleads the fifth on that when I ask if she'll be the Antichrist. But she's just totally evil. And if you're following her, it's because you're as evil as she is and you just don't have any love in your heart. You're not even devoted to a cause. Your only cause is yourself. See, Zach Knight had one redeeming quality, which is why Rule 13 fell in love with him. He was devoted to a cause. Whether the cause was right or wrong, he was devoted to it. And he got a following for that reason. Angelina has no cause other than herself. She's just totally self-absorbed. And she basically worships herself as the most beautiful, knockout, hot woman that everybody is dying to make love to, which actually makes her ugly. But she doesn't understand that because she just doesn't realize that you can't be beautiful if you don't have any love in your heart.